The war between Ukraine and Russia affects many countries directly or indirectly. While Western countries are helping Ukraine, they are emptying their arsenals and imposing heavy economic sanctions on Russia and its supporters. Russia counts on its allies in the face of heavy sanctions, but Russia is finally starting to break out after a long chain of sanctions. In this process, Russia probably relied most on China. However, the balance is turned upside down as China lures Russia and makes Moscow dependent on Beijing in many areas by taking advantage of the war. At a time when Putin was under great international pressure, his relations with China were also hampered close to Russia in the Ukraine war. China is now changing its position slowly and without angering Russia. After the Wagner rebellion against Russian President Vladimir Putin and the 11th EU economic sanctions package, a very heavy punch to Russia comes from China. Geopolitically, China benefits from the war that started in Ukraine, and in recent years, the Russian Federation has become heavily dependent on Beijing. So how did China achieve this? A sudden uppercut came from China after the Western sanctions on Russia. Russia was using China's yuan to circumvent sanctions. However, the People's Bank of China has completely restricted transfers from Russia for fear of secondary sanctions from the West. The People's Bank of China has begun restricting transactions using the yuan between Russian customers and lenders in the US, European Union, Switzerland, and the UK. The restrictions also affect transfers where the Bank of China is the correspondent or intermediary bank that carries money from Russia to third-party countries. Russia's major banks, Model Bank and Phenom, have confirmed that the restrictions are correct, but Phenom has confirmed that it has received a notification of the Bank of China's restrictions on yuan transactions. Pavel Semyonov, chairman from the board of directors of Russian bank Phenom, said he tried not to anger the Chinese by saying that the decision was made not by China but by the EU and the USA. The Central Bank of China's sanctions on Russian bans came as the Russian economy became more dependent on the currency amid sanctions over the Ukraine war, including the banning of some Russian banks from the SWIFT global financial messaging system. Also, China has put a very heavy crochet on Russian aviation. With its latest move, China has buried Russia's hopes of creating a rival to Boeing and Airbus. The Chinese side refused the services of the Russian UAC, which was supposed to create a glider and wanted to participate in the production of engines for the CRJ-929. Hopes of Russia to create a competitor with China for Western Boeing and Airbus aircraft failed. Celestial Empire has excluded Moscow from the CRJ-909 cruise ship project for the 6th year at the Leberjet Air Show. The aircraft was presented as an exclusively Chinese development, with neither the Russian Federation as a state nor the Russian involved in any way. It was originally planned that the UAC would create a glider and be involved in the production of engines for the CRJ-929. However, the Chinese side decided to pursue the project on its own. At the same time, it was noted that the Russian Federation's participation in this project faced problems from the very beginning, since the Chinese partner, Comac, did not allow the Russian side to generate revenue from the sale of ships in the domestic market. Instead, the Russian side was offered more sales share in the international market. But this did not suit Moscow, as the CRJ-929 was expected to be in demand in China. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February of last year, which led to Western sanctions against the Russian aviation industry, the Celestial Empire decided to refuse cooperation with the Russian Federation and move on to Western developments. In particular, the Chinese side insisted on the use of German and American components instead of the Russian-made chassis. Analysts evaluating the impact of Western sanctions on Russian civil aviation concluded that by 2026, Russian air carriers will lose half of the aircraft. The reason was seen as the loss of access to foreign components and services. It was also reported in November last year that Aeroflot, the largest Russian air carrier, lost one of every 4 aircraft. Analysts also said that they could force Russia into a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, even though they knew that China would weaken Vladimir Putin's regime. So how did Russia become dependent on China? First, Beijing received a large Russian market which has no competitors for its devalued reserves of energy, resources, and goods. Second, Chinese military planners gain invaluable experience by watching the war in Ukraine. By the way, the Russian army did not prove itself well. Therefore, Moscow should consider the security of its eastern borders. Also, the People's Republic of China understood that such a war would weaken the Western economy and make the Putin-led Kremlin more subordinate to Chinese interests. Beijing will not directly take risks and help the Russian Federation. Russia was now caught in China's net. It is already clear that the war in Ukraine is bringing China's rivals in the West together and thus hampering China's plans to take over Taiwan. What is clear is that Vladimir Putin deceived Xi Jinping, or she didn't do enough to contain Putin. China is becoming the master of all industries in the Russian Federation, buying jobs left by Western companies. And in May, China declared Vladivostok an inland port. From now on, goods traveling from one Chinese province to another will pass through this Russian city without customs procedures. On the other hand, the Chinese defrauded the Russians for money. A Chinese TikToker pretended to be Kid Orkovsky to sell subscribers from the Russian Federation. A resident of Henan Province, China, decided to start a personal blog to promote it, thereby selling goods from China, including vodka and honey, to its subscribers. A man named Biol Kati pretended to be a Kitravis and, using a neural network, showed himself as a participant in hostilities in Ukraine. With the help of a neural network, the Chinese not only changed their appearance, but even distorted their voice. The guy clearly showed how the Kadirovsi can shoot staged videos about the wars in Ukraine without any problems. He told his subscribers how he fought against the US Marine Corps, how he seized nuclear power plants in Ukraine. He reached nearly 400,000 subscribers on his TikTok channel. After that, the Chinese opened their online store and began to sell goods. The Chinese immediately shut down his channel as soon as it was revealed. But during this time, he managed to sell to 10 goods. So how was Russia's relationship with its #1 ally, and how did it get to this point? Just a few weeks before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping met in Moscow and published a memorandum of understanding on February 4, 2022, in which they touched upon almost all issues in the world and declared their unlimited partnership. Many commentators interpreted this as China and Russia's desire to create a new power center and global order. Moreover, this partnership was published at a time when Russia continued to build up on the Ukrainian border, and the Western Bloc warned the world public that Russia could invade Ukraine at any moment. As a matter of fact, Russia's invasion of Ukraine took place very soon after Russia and China announced their partnership in almost every issue to the whole world. One of the main topics of discussion after the occupation was China's attitude towards Russia. Over the past year, China has taken a stance that neither fully supports Russian or is completely against the Russian invasion, as many governments in the non-Western world did. It continued its economic relations with Russia and even expanded this cooperation due to the space opened by the economic sanctions of the West. However, with the economic breakthroughs of China towards Russia, the wind between the two countries has reversed. They did not expect such a move from China, a close ally of Russian President Vladimir Putin. In short, while Russia's invasion of Ukraine also creates global debates, to a large extent, the relations between Russia and China continue to draw attention in this new world. The strength of armies is proportional to the number of soldiers and equipment they have. Maybe this is a big lie, because some of the facts experienced in wars cannot be calculated with this mathematics. It was claimed that the Russian army had over 2 million personnel, including reservists. It was also said to have modern weapons and equipment and powerful ammo. However, after Russia began its occupation of Ukraine, the reality of the Russian army's strength became questionable. The Russian army is struggling to find soldiers to take part in the occupation of Ukraine and is therefore suffering a major setback in the war. The Russian occupiers are trying to organize attacks to prevent this setback against Ukraine, but they fail in almost all of these attacks. The recent events in the town of Marinka in Donetsk Oblast, along with the failure of the Russian army, showed that the math of soldiers and equipment in calculating army strength is a big lie. The Russian army entered the town of Marinka with tanks and combat vehicles to attack the Ukrainian 79th Air Assault Brigade. The goal of the invaders was to capture this brigade. The Russian army, which is expected to carry out major attacks on the anniversary of the war, can only attack Ukrainian troops, and even these attacks are unsuccessful. The Russian offensive in Marinka also ended in failure, and only due to the perfect operation of one soldier. The Russian army set out with 5 tanks and 3 infantry fighting vehicles to attack the Ukrainian 79th Air Assault Brigade in Marinka. As they approached the brigade, they encountered an unexpected development. A Ukrainian soldier was in ambush to blow up tanks and vehicles belonging to the Russian occupiers. In this ambush, the Ukrainian soldier used the Javelin missile system, which was added to the Ukrainian army's inventory with the help of US aid packages. The Ukrainian soldiers' historic attack was caught on camera. The Ukrainian Defense Ministry posted on its social media the footage of the explosion of the tanks of the Russian invaders targeted by the heroic Ukrainian soldier. The Ministry of Defense wrote the following in its post: Marinka Donetsk region. Ukrainian soldier, a brilliant operator of Javelin, destroyed 5 Russian tanks in one battle. American weapon in Ukrainian hands works wonders. In total, enemy lost 5 tanks and 7 IAF in that sector that day. In its post, the Ukrainian Defense Ministry referred to the Ukrainian soldier as a brilliant operator because the Ukrainian soldier had single-handedly accomplished an attack that could have been carried out by an army. When the Ukrainian soldier saw the tanks of the Russian invaders approaching the brigade, he placed Javelin missile systems in different areas. The tanks of the Russian invaders were the target of the Javelin missiles. The soldier waited for the best time to fire the missiles. When the time came, the missiles were fired one by one. The Javelin missiles blew up the tanks in the Russian invaders' tank convoy. In the video shared by the Ukrainian Defense Ministry about the moment of the attack, it is seen that the tanks caught fire after a violent explosion. The Russian army lost a total of 5 tanks and 3 infantry fighting vehicles as a result of the attack by a single Ukrainian soldier. Although no information on how many Russian invaders died in this attack was shared, it is estimated that dozens of Russian invaders died as a result of this attack. Another remarkable statement in the Ukrainian Defense Ministry's post was the sentence, "American weapon in Ukrainian hands works wonders." This sentence also provides information about Javelin missile systems, because Javelin missile systems can be fired by being deployed to certain points and can also be used by being transported as part of the military aid packages provided to Ukraine. The United States has added a total of 8,500 Javelin missiles to the Ukrainian Army's inventory. Javelin missile systems produced by the United States have played a major role in the successful operations of the Ukrainian Army. Javelin missile systems, officially known as FGM-148, are also known as anti-tank missiles. The most important feature of these missile systems is their portability. Javelin missile systems weighing 12 kilograms have a range of 2,500 meters. Ukrainian soldiers actively use this missile system in many operations after being trained by US soldiers on the use of Javelin missile systems. Since the beginning of the Russian-Ukrainian war, the Russian army has lost thousands of tanks. However, in the last few months, the Russian army's tanks losses has started to increase rapidly. Recently, the armed forces of Ukraine shared a video of Russian occupier tanks being blown up in the town of Volodar in Donetsk Oblast. In the same week, the Ukrainian Security Service shared a video of Ukrainian drones targeting 5 T-72 tanks and 2 S-3 Akatsiya howitzer of the Russian occupiers. In addition, pro-Ukrainian social media accounts continue to post videos of tank destruction in different regions every day. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine recently announced that Russia lost 16 tanks, 24 armored vehicles and 3 drones in 24 hours. In total, the Russian army lost 3,397 tanks, 6,658 armored combat vehicles from the day it started its occupation of Ukraine until March 3rd. Military aids from Western and European countries play an important role in the successful offenses of the Ukrainian army. The United States of America is at the forefront of these military aids. Since the beginning of the war, the United States has provided Ukraine with nearly $50 billion in military aid. These aid packages determine the course of the Russian-Ukrainian war. The United States has provided the Ukrainian army with important military equipment such as HIMARS and Javelin missile systems, Patriot air defense systems, and DEM-1 Abrams tanks. This has strengthened the Ukrainian army day by day. The Russian invaders were unable to withstand the military aid provided to Ukraine by Western and European countries, especially the United States of America. The problem of military personnel of the Russian army is now known to the whole world. Russia's equipment and ammunition problem is also growing every day. It is seen that most of the equipment destroyed in the successful attacks of the Ukrainian army is from the Soviet era. In addition, soldiers who surrendered to the Ukrainian army admit that the Russian army's equipment is very old. Pavel Filatyev, the most famous of the soldiers who surrendered to the Ukrainian troops to escape the inhumane behavior of the Russian invaders, stated in his 141-page book, SOV-56, that the rifle given to him before the war was rusty and the strap broke. The problem of military personnel and equipment of the Russian army is the most important indicator that it will not be able to achieve success against Ukraine, which is getting stronger day by day. How do you think Russia can resist against Ukraine? How do you evaluate the successful operation of the heroic soldier of the 79th Air Assault Brigade in Ukraine? Can the Russian army make up for those losses? We are curious about your opinions as a daily news team. We continue to report all developments in the Russia-Ukraine war with our impartial and accurate journalism approach. The violence of the war between Ukraine and Russia has taken a very different dimension, with Moscow's attacks that threaten Ukrainian civilian life and civilian infrastructure. Russian cruise missiles have threatened many innocent lives in the past days, and Ukraine is gaining the right to retaliate against these aggressive and inhumane attacks by Russia. Strong attacks by unknown aircraft on Russian air bases and military facilities in border cities from the Ukrainian direction in the past months have deeply affected Moscow. The Kremlin administration was hit from where they did not expect, and this scared them. Now, the Russian cities were completely open to air attacks, and the violence of the war was shifting from the Ukrainian front into the depths of Russia. This could be attributed entirely to Moscow's violation of the rules of war, and airstrikes on Russian cities could be seen as an equal trade-off. With this fear, the Moscow administration began to set up air defense systems in St. Petersburg and Moscow with great panic, while the Kremlin administration is showing their strength by stating that they will destroy Western ammunition under any circumstance. They do not give up on taking various measures to protect themselves from the Ukrainian armed forces. Explosions have been recorded with increasing frequency in Russian cities near the Ukrainian border in recent months, following a series of territorial concessions by Vladimir Putin's armed forces. Russian air defense systems took action to protect the city of Belgorod, 25 miles north of the Ukrainian border. Locals reported more than 30 explosions earlier today. The attack is the latest in a series of derelict explosions on Russian soil. Regional Governor Vyacheslav Gladkov reported via Telegram that explosions were heard all over the city and there was damage to power lines. Panicked by these attacks on Russian soil, Russian leader Vladimir Putin began to struggle to protect his other cities, especially the capital. Moscow panicked after Ukraine's cross-border operations. Vladimir Putin is deploying deadly anti-aircraft systems around Moscow, fearing a Russian attack. The defense strategy shows that Russia fears a Ukrainian attack on the capital. Vladimir Putin has deployed deadly S-400 defense missiles at 2 points in the capital designed to destroy aircraft, cruise and ballistic missiles, including medium-range missiles. One S-400 air defense system was deployed in the fields belonging to the Russian State Agricultural University, northwest of Moscow, and the other in the Lozny Ostrov National Park, near the Sokolniki district in the northeast of the city. The S-400 is easily the superior option in terms of firepower, capable of hitting air targets at distances of up to 250 kilometers and intercepting ballistic missiles at a range of up to 60 kilometers. It also proved capable of attacking aircraft, as older American-made aircraft such as the F-16 and F-18 Farad's Super Hornet likely faced difficulties to evade it. In the case of Ukraine's poorly equipped Air Force, such a missile defense system would likely be an adequate deterrent. Russian leader Vladimir Putin is deploying Panzers I air defense systems around Moscow alongside the S-400 air defense systems for urban defense purposes. Panzer is probably the ideal option. The Panzer defense system is designed to be used at closer range, featuring a mix of anti-aircraft guns and missiles. In addition, Panzer can be bought for under $15 million, much cheaper than the S-400 air defense systems. Local residents living in Russia say the deployments are new to the Russian capital. Pictures and videos were circulating on Twitter, where users said they were showing Panzers I air defense systems on the roofs of several buildings. In Moscow, photos and videos circulating on Twitter showed images of Panzers I air defense systems on the roofs of several key government buildings in the Russian capital, including an unmanned administrative building and the Russian Defense Ministry's National Defense Management Center. Reports of new air defense additions in Moscow came on the same day as Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov warned that it would escalate if Western countries supply Ukraine with long-range weapons. We are in the third week of January. Both Ukraine and Russia are struggling to prepare for their spring offensive. When spring comes and the ground is completely dry, it is impossible not to experience hot conflicts on the front lines. Thus, mobile offensive operations will become viable once again. Especially important developments in this week seem to escalate the war, as the Current Affairs YouTube channel. All of our findings are created by the work and analysis of our field warfare expert team and are based on data from the US, UK, Russia, and Ukraine, Ministry of Defense, and independent war analysis and monitoring sources. While the United States has flown weapons and other aid to Ukraine since the war began at the end of February last year, President Joe Biden has repeatedly stated that he will not provide weapons that could be used for attacks inside Russia. But Ukraine may not need to rely on the United States for its ability to attack inside Russia. The Ukrainian defense company Ukroboronprom announced the other day that it has completed testing a long-range drone. This drone has a range of more than 1,000 kilometers. If this drone is used by the Ukrainian armed forces, we look forward to how successful Russia's defense systems will be. While Russian leader Vladimir Putin is trying to protect Russian cities by placing defense systems around Moscow, he is also looking for an opportunity to counterattack in the Ukraine war. Vladimir Putin wants to involve Belarus in the Ukraine war. With this move, the Russian leader will open a new front in the Ukrainian war, thus further wearing down the Ukrainian forces. However, at this point, things are not progressing as Vladimir Putin had planned. Lukashenko prepares for civil turmoil as Putin aims to drag Belarus into the Ukraine war. Lukashenko is already fully participating in the war, but not sending Belarusian troops to Ukraine is not because Lukashenko did not want to participate. Lukashenko knows that Belarusians do not see Ukrainians as enemies. More than 90% of Belarusians oppose joining forces with Russia to attack Ukraine. That's why he can't send his troops to the war in Ukraine. If Lukashenko sends the soldiers serving in the Belarusian army to the Ukrainian front, this action will be followed by a domestic rebellion. Russian leader Vladimir Putin's move to Belarus is failing, but Mr. Putin has no plans to end the Ukraine war. For this, the Russian leader comes up with new plans. It is possible to see a Russian army that has renewed its strength, especially in the spring. Russian President Vladimir Putin may soon announce a second mobilization move ahead of a new offensive against Ukraine. While Ukraine has driven Russian forces out of much of Ukraine over the past year, it has only come at an enormous human cost. Putin's two-week Bakhmut dream of victory may be over, but the Russian leader still believes he can win a war of attrition. After all, Ukraine has less than a third of Russia's population. Even with Western supplies, Ukraine is running out of ammunition faster than Western governments can supply them. With this new Russian approach looming on the horizon, the time has come to fundamentally change the way that the US and its allies approach Ukraine. To date, the White House has carefully adjusted its military aid to allow Ukraine to fight Russian forces on Ukrainian soil, but not directly lead the war to Russia. The rationale for this move was to ensure Ukraine's self-defense without provoking Russia to expand its war and perhaps even use nuclear weapons. Diplomats also hope that reigning in Ukrainian resistance would give Putin a diplomatic avenue to sabotage his reputation and compromise. This didn't work. Not only is Putin making a fuss, he also interprets the US restriction as giving the green light to continue its offensive, whose ultimate goal is to wipe independent Ukraine off the map. The US now needs to train Ukraine not only on the platforms it needs, such as the Abrams tanks, but also on the platforms it may need in the future, such as the F-16s. Instead of limiting Ukraine's arsenal to relatively short-range missiles, the United States and Western countries should allow Ukraine to attack assembly areas and pillars where Russian forces can gather with aircraft, drones, missiles, or artillery. When Kiev increases its attacks on Russian cities, the possibility of Vladimir Putin to continue this relentless war will be considerably weakened. We think that the Kiev government should pursue this possibility. The war in Ukraine pushed the Russian army into near collapse. According to the Ukrainian General Staff, more than 180,000 Russian soldiers have been eliminated in this battle. So far, it's estimated that there are 3 times that number of wounded Russian soldiers. All these heavy losses created the danger of the second wave of mobilization in the country. If you remember when Vladimir Putin tried to mobilize hundreds of thousands of his citizens to fight in his invasion of Ukraine, complete chaos, fear, and anger echoed in Russia. Russia was going through one of the most difficult periods in its history. It's estimated that after the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, a total of 900,000 Russian citizens and people living in Russia left Russia, including 300,000 by mid-March of the same year, 500,000 by the end of August, and an additional 400,000 at the beginning of October. After late October, Russian departures slowed, but anti-war protests in Russia escalated. The anger of the Russians and the turmoil in the Russian cities increased even more as anti-war protests escalate. The Kremlin is once again making a decision that angers its citizens. But nowadays, due to the fear of the second mobilization decision, a much heavier process has started in Russia. While the Kremlin was dragging the Russian people into great anxiety with a new mobilization law, hundreds of thousands of Russian citizens began to flee the country and emigrate en masse in 2023, reaching approximately 1 million in 2022. It is foreseen that migration will increase to over 1.5 million by the middle of 2023. So what are the decisions and consequences that caused the Russians to leave their country and emigrate? Let's dive into the details of the socio-political situation in Russia, which angers Russian citizens and pushes them to take a stand against the Kremlin. The Kremlin administration immediately began to seek solutions to replace the lost soldiers. A striking decision came from the Russian leader, Vladimir Putin, in this regard. Recently, Russian leader Vladimir Putin made a shocking decision to stop his citizens trying to escape military service. Vladimir Putin signed the new law preventing desertion from the military. Deputies in the Russian Duma passed the law in both houses of parliament this week. This decision could have major implications for the Kremlin's war plans in Ukraine as it seeks to support Russian forces in anticipation of a Ukrainian counterattack. At a fundamental level, the new law makes it extremely difficult for mostly Russian men, but also Russian women with special skills to evade military service. However, it's already observed that hundreds of thousands of Russian citizens have started to leave the country in addition to 2022. Due to the socio-political effects of the war, the Russians use their only option to get out of this situation. As we mentioned, running away. In addition, the new law brought new applications. Until now, Russian conscripts had to personally go to a conscript's home or workplace to deliver a paper summons. This system will now be replaced by electronic notifications or emails sent through systems, including web portals that Russians use to pay their electricity bills, taxes, and other services. In this way, the Russian authorities will almost forcibly deport their own citizens to the front. The electronic notification will be binding from the moment the Moscow government approves the submission. In this way, the recruitment process will be much faster, and the legal process of conscription will now depend on a single button. In Russia, those who do not immediately come to Russian recruitment offices will soon face a new set of restrictions on banking, property sales, and even access to a driver's license, provisions that prevent those fleeing the draft from selling or transferring property, prevent Russians who have fled abroad, in particular, from turning their assets into cash. This will be a blow to free will because the views of Russian citizens who reject the war in Ukraine will no longer matter. In fact, there are millions of Russian citizens in Russia who oppose the Ukraine war. But this decision of President Vladimir Putin confronts Russian citizens with a war they don't want, albeit by force. The chances of Russian citizens objecting to the conscription decision are almost impossible. Prior to this reform, those who refused a military service order faced up to 10 years in prison. Now, the penal sanctions in this regard are still very severe. Meanwhile, the Kremlin officials and lawmakers have made it clear that they view the law as a response to problems in implementing Putin's partial mobilization decree last fall, which called for 300,000 troops to fight in Ukraine. In other words, Putin started a secret mobilization in the country to replace the losses in the Russian army. In fact, this decision by the Russian leader provided reinforcements for the front line, but as we mentioned, it also forced hundreds of thousands of Russians to flee the country to be exempted from compulsory military service. Many anti-war Russian citizens fled service inside the country by changing their addresses or simply claiming they did not see the draft notice. Even now, all Russian borders are starting to move, just as they were at the time of mobilization. The reason for this is that the escapees in Russia still continue violently. Escapes have increased not only within the borders of Russia, but also in the Crimea. Hundreds of thousands of Russians who did not want to participate in the Ukrainian war fled without thinking of the end in order to establish a new order and avoid the effects of the war. As in the mobilization decision, yes, there are millions of Russian citizens who oppose this law, but many Kremlin and Putin supporters, i.e., supporters of the new law, said it was time to close the loopholes that had caused some of the setbacks of last year's mobilization. These statements are seen as signs of a new era of chaos in Russia. But on this issue, The Kremlin insists that the new law by no means signals a second wave of mobilization for Ukraine, although some experts are skeptical whether the Moscow government should call on more Russians or fight will eventually become much clearer in the coming months, especially as Ukraine prepares to launch a counterattack to retake the occupied territories. In fact, in recent months, the Russian military has focused on recruiting volunteers and has offered contract soldiers much higher wages to fight in Ukraine. The Moscow administration has offered Russian citizens who want to fight a salary of $2,600 per month. This figure is a huge amount for Russians living in small towns or rural areas in Russia. However, the Moscow administration could not provide a sufficient number of soldiers to its army with full pay. Therefore, Putin has only one option left, and that is to force his citizens into war. Although the Kremlin administration has declared that this situation has nothing to do with mobilization, what is being done in Russia at the moment is just a mobilization. Russian authorities seem to be aware of how unpopular last year's mobilization move was. Nationwide protests and a series of public complaints about the conscripts' lack of equipment and training for the war began. Complaints that Russian citizens usually post in public videos actually made a lot of noise. After these reactions snowballed in Russia, President Putin began to admit that mistakes were made, albeit rare. However, the Moscow administration's decision to make such a decision not only causes an atmosphere of turmoil in the country, as everyone predicts, but also collapses the professional structure within the Russian army. But the only thing that Russian officials are focusing on right now is increasing the number of soldiers in the Russian army. So it's not quality that matters for Russians right now, but quantity. But this situation may even cause the Russians to lose the war because Russian citizens who were forced into the war will not voluntarily serve on the territory of Ukraine. This situation, on the other hand, seems to only aggravate the losses of the Russian army. In the midst of all these setbacks, the Russian Ministry of Defense announced that it planned to increase the size of the army by 30% to 1.5 million soldiers. This figure means adding a few 100,000 more soldiers to the existing ranks, on top of the contracted volunteers. But many prominent war analysts think that Russian leader Vladimir Putin will not be able to achieve this. As a matter of fact, it is very difficult to force someone to do something. Most importantly, the Russian administration is actually signing its own death warrant by forcibly recruiting its citizens. At present, the situation will worsen if Russian citizens face such a decision when they have no confidence in the government due to the Ukraine war. In short, Russian leader Vladimir Putin continues to play the cards in his hand, one by one. However, the cards in the hands of the Russian leader began to run out over time. Russia's return to the difficult days of the former Soviet era seems very close.